what happened when you decided to leave the Times?
Well,
I mean, how did you come to, I'd like the story. How did you
yeah.
come to that decision?
Well, there was a kind of forced ideological conformity that was happening. And it became like a battle to get any piece through that didn't conform to the narrative. And anything that didn't
And how would
conform,
that battle manifest itself? So you would commission
in all
a
kinds of
story?
ways. In all kinds of ways. Yeah. I mean, it would be, I'd like to do a column on this, and me being tremendously like having to jump through hoops and get 10 more sources, whereas other pieces from other writers would just sail through with like obvious embarrassing errors. Not that I haven't had my own share of errors. I have, and they're horrifically embarrassing, and anyone can find them online. But I'm saying, if you didn't comport with the orthodoxy, then your character and your work were just unbelievably scrutinized in a way that another person's weren't. When it came to
so the load increased, the effort load
yeah, I mean,
increased.
when it came to commissioning things, like I remember Ayan, her CLE, called me the smuggler, because early on when I was there, again, in this very brief, good period of self-reflection, I was able to get an op-ed that she wrote into the New York Times. And she was like, I can't believe you were able to do that. So there was this brief period in the beginning where the humiliation of getting Trump wrong, I think, led to an opening of the Overton window. But then, for reasons I can't really figure out, it really, really, really just closed again, and it narrowed much more so, like to a sliver in a way. It was much narrower than, I would say, pre the election. And of course, Trump had a tremendous amount to do with it. If you believed that, and I think a lot of my colleagues genuinely believed this, that Trump was a fundamental threat to America, to the Republic, to minorities, we can go on and on and on. We know the argument, we could read it anywhere else. Then you were morally obligated to defeat that threat. And that meant that anything that flirted with any number of topics where he was on a particular side of it, then the right was the correct position was always to be on the opposite side of it. And so you saw this really, really clearly, let's say, in the lab leak theory, right, which was completely of the Wuhan coronavirus, which increasingly it seems like the coronavirus was, unintentionally, let's say, leaked from this lab in Wuhan. Well, that became unsayable, and it became unsayable because people in the Trump administration were saying that that was the case, and so everything was seen through the prism of this incredibly singular figure of Trump. So that sped it all up. And then you had the summer, and you had the killing of George Floyd, and that just brought everything that was sort of at a low boil just absolutely bubbling over. And the way that it bubbled over most acutely was in the choice in June to run an op-ed by Republican Senator Tom Cotton that said, not that the National Guard should be brought in to quell peaceful protests, but that the National Guard should be brought in to quell violent rioting. It was a controversial piece by any stretch in that really sensitive moment. But it was a view, frankly, that was shared by the majority of Americans, if you go back and look at polls at that time. But inside the context, the rarefied context of the New York Times, not only was this op-ed seen as controversial, it was seen as literal violence. Literal violence. More than 800 of my colleagues signed a letter saying that this op-ed literally put the lives of Black New York Times staffers in danger. And anyone that didn't...
What was the argument? What kind of argument was made in favor of that position?
That the argument was, first of all, it was a misreading of his op-ed. It was based on a fundamental misreading that insisted that his op-ed was about bringing in the military to put down justified, understandable riots in reaction to George Floyd. So they never made the distinction. They collapsed the distinction between bringing in the National Guard to put down violent rioting and bringing in the National Guard to put down peaceful protests. And then they said, that because police and the military are systemically racist, I'm being crude and just sort of giving you the overview, that this move would necessarily result in an inordinate amount of Black death. the death of Black Americans. So that was the argument. And what happened was not from the top a defense of the op-ed and a defense of all of the various
And was this an op-ed you had commissioned?
No, I had nothing to do with the op-ed.
Okay.
I ended
so
up
you're
being,
just watching this.
Yeah, I ended up being sort of brought in as a kind of punching bag because I ended up tweeting out some tweets that I think hold up extremely well about that this was a very, very useful litmus test to understand the generational divide inside the New York Times. But I had nothing to do with the op-ed. But the people that did have something to do with the op-ed, my 25-year-old.
I want to ask you something about that generational divide. Sorry.
It's okay.
Well, I'm still trying to think through this. The education of young people to adopt the viewpoint that our social institutions are fundamentally corrupt and driven by power. And so then I think, well, how much of that, this calls for speculation, how much of that is a consequence of the breakdown of family structure? I mean, so I see the positive element of our social institutions as something like the positive aspect of the paternal spirit. So it's a father, it's the positive father who encourages in exactly the way that you encourage the writers that were under your care to express themselves and develop.
Am I the father in that situation?
Well, you would be, you're female, but you're working in the patriarchy. So yes, I would say symbolically speaking, that's a manifestation of, well, the spirit of your Jewish ancestors. Let's put it that way. Well, I mean that. You know, and you're the one who said that tradition has shaped you to such a degree. It's like, well, you feel you have an obligation to embody that. Well, is it not a paternal spirit? That's the tradition. And but what if you've never experienced that?
I don't know if I would call it paternal or not. That's not the way I think about things. But I do think, I don't know
if your family's broken, if you've never had a positive relationship with someone who's...
I think it's different than that. I think it's about, should corporations, which is what the New York Times is in the end of the day, should they be moral actors? That's the big difference. Like, there's a sense among the younger generation that a newspaper or a tech company or whatever, the place that you work should somehow also not just be about pursuing the bottom line, but should also be a manifestation of what you consider to be good politics and good morals. And that's why you see, you know, I don't know if you followed this entire story at Coinbase that I think is really, really interesting, where basically the heads of Coinbase said, because they felt like rather than pursuing excellence for the company, so much of employees' energy and attention and time was being devoted to, you know, using Slack to discuss the politics of the day. And they basically said, look, no more politics at work. Work is not a place for politics. Work is a place for making Coinbase excellent. And if you're uncomfortable with that, we're going to give you a really, really nice severance package. You've seen Basecamp follow suit. You've seen, and I suspect that we're going to see.
When did this happen?
This happened, I would say Coinbase in the past 2 months, and then Basecamp, another company, much more recently. And this, I'm really watching that trend, because if you're running a company and rather than, let's take the case of the New York Times, you're not spending your time reporting and editing and commissioning, but you're spending your time basically being like an offense archaeologist, looking through things that other people have published to decide whether or not an adjective was Orientalist or not. Like, that's a bad use of your time if you're supposed to be producing the best newspaper in the world. And so that's one thing I'm watching for. I'm curious if what Coinbase did is going to take off, because I think it's extremely, I thought that was just really, really, really smart strategy to say, no, that's not going to be what we do at this company. But suffice it to say, the New York Times has not followed Coinbase's suit. And what happened after, so the fallout from the Tom Cotton episode was that within 48 hours, my immediate boss was reassigned. The boss who had hired me, James Bennett, was pushed out of the paper after he was struggle sessioned in front of thousands of employees at the company. in
Tell us about that.
I will. Well, in Slack channels with thousands of people, guillotines and axe emojis were put next to his name and my name. And no one said a word about that. Remember, this is an ideology that tells us silence is violence, and
But guillotine
exactly.
emojis aren't.
Exactly. But basically what happened was that, it's the same script that's happened everywhere else. Like a normal human being who looked out and saw that 800 of his colleagues felt that he decided to run an op-ed that literally put their lives in danger. Well, the normal human response to that, as you explained before, is, I'm so sorry. But unfortunately, in the rubric of this ideology, I'm so sorry is evidence of your guilt. It's blood in the water. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, I'm so sorry is a confession.
Yes.
It's a confession. And
yes,
so,
which means don't apologize if
yes,
you haven't done anything wrong.
Yes.
Because
so
that's exactly right.
And so he was pushed out of the paper, and perhaps most disgustingly, my colleague, who's a very dear friend of mine, Adam Rubenstein, who was one of the editors, one of 7 editors who worked on the piece, his name was leaked by others of our colleagues to the news side of the paper. And a 25-year-old editor at the very beginning of his career was sort of the guy that was thrown under the bus, and he ultimately ended up leaving the paper too. And I found that to be the most disgusting part of the entire episode, because as everyone who works in any organization knows, and he didn't there was no mistake that was in that op-ed. But generally what happens in a collegial environment is if someone makes a mistake. So for example, months prior to the Tom Cotton episode, the New York Times ran a flagrantly anti-Semitic cartoon in which Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, is shown wearing it's shown as a dachshund, a long wiener dog, wearing a collar with a Jewish star, and he's shown leading a blind Trump who's wearing a yarmulke on his head. People can look it up. Now, everyone in the editorial staff knew who chose that op-ed, that cartoon, and no one in the public knows his name. And that's exactly as it should be. It's exactly as it should be. And yet in this case, a 25-year-old editor was hung out to dry. And so essentially what I gathered from this entire episode was risk-taking can get you fired. Running an op-ed that other people inside the paper considered controversial could get you struggle session in front of the entire company. And knowing that that was literally what my job was, well, that job became impossible. And the thing that happened that it's really unbelievable. If you're thinking about like running a large organization, this will sound as insane as it is. The new rule became kind of editing by consensus. So every single op-ed editor had to say that they were comfortable with every single op-ed. Well, you can imagine that if 9.9 out of 10 people agree with this view of the world, that my job became impossible. By the time that I, sort of the last few weeks of the paper, I was told explicitly, don't commission op-eds anymore, because none of them were able to get through this new gauntlet. And I said to myself, why did I go into journalism? I did not go into journalism to be rich. I went into journalism because it's a job that allows you to pursue your curiosity, which is incredible. And if I can't do that anymore, and if I need to sort of like become a half version of myself and sit on my hands about an increasing number of topics that I think are incredibly urgent, what's the point of doing this? And so I felt like, I could kind of like become a husk, or I could leave of my own volition before something similar happened to me. And so I decided to leave and left in a very public way, and having no idea sort of what I would do next. And I will be honest, it took me a long time to sort of like get my bearing after I did that.